So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Mallory Newell, Vice President with Ipsos's Public Opinion Team. Mallory, you have the floor.
Great. Thanks, Ellen. Appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Nice to be with you today. Hope you're all having a good Thursday. Welcome to our latest Know the New America Public Opinion Update. This webinar, as always, will kind of dive deep into a number of different topics and take a look at recent Ipsos public polling. And we're here to kind of help you all make sense and explain some of the trends behind the data. Joining me today is my new-ish colleague. This is his first webinar, but he's not brand new. He's been here for a few months, Senior Vice President Alec Tyson. We'll hear from Alec a little bit on the state of the political parties and a spotlight on perspectives around AI. Alec, glad you're with us today. So with that in mind, let's jump right in. We've got a lot to cover, obviously a lot happening these days. And so I just wanted to kind of set the stage for what we'll be talking about today. First, we've got the political landscape, the economic landscape, and then, as I mentioned, I'll turn it over to Alec for a look at the state of the political parties and perspectives on AI. And then we'll close with some data around public health, including, well, we don't have slides for it because it was just released a few hours ago, some brand new Axios Ipsos American Health Index data. So as always, I think it's important to kind of ground ourselves in the landscape that we're in and just remember sort of the backdrop that we're looking at all of this public opinion data. And really, as our title talks about, we at Ipsos seek to understand and to help our clients know the new America. And really, that's just kind of a nod to this point in time that we're in, the uncertainty that came with the 2024 presidential election and the past few months that we've been living in, both politically, economically, and socially as well. And so these are sort of our three core trends that we ground ourselves in, and really how we seek to help ourselves and our clients understand the realities of this landscape that we're in right now. First, and we'll talk about this a lot today, but we're at a point in time where distrust in institutions, but also interpersonally, is widespread, and in many cases is at an all-time low. And this, I think, feeds to a lot of the divisiveness that we're experiencing in our society today. The second reality here is that Americans hold a lot of nuance on topics. I think some of the things that we'll cover today, particularly public health, is a great example of that. And yes, our society is incredibly polarized by political affiliation. But if we rely solely on the traditional red versus blue distinction, that really only explains part of the story. And through our analysis and through looking at all of this data and trends, we really seek to understand that nuance and the gray areas that exist. And then finally, I think because of these sort of two first realities, the third one, words matter more than ever, right? To operate successfully in this current environment, brands and organizations need to understand the issues that matter to their consumers, to their constituencies, to their stakeholders, and how they align with their organization's mission and values, just to make sure that communication in this environment where people are wary and are mistrusting, that communication is authentic as possible. So with that, let's dive in and kind of talk about the why. Here's what's going on with the political landscape. I think a common theme, you've heard me say this for the past few months, that unease, that friction tends to be the continued prevailing temperature today. There's a lot of uncertainty both around the policy agenda as well as our short-term economic future. And so starting off here, we have a look at where President Trump's job approval rating is sitting right now. We've taken the average of a couple of different poll aggregators. So this is not Ipsos data. Ipsos data is included in these aggregators, but this is really the average of public polling writ large right now. And what we see is that the president has kind of settled into this low to mid 40% range, where he's been for the past few months. It's a little notch above where he was in his first term, and above the levels that former President Biden sat at for most of his presidency. But as I just noted, President Trump's approval rating has been pretty steady over the past few months. And as we've discussed, I think on the last webinar or two webinars, what we see with President Trump is that he really seems to have kind of a higher floor and a lower ceiling. So a little bit less fluctuation in his approval rating compared to some of his predecessors. Obviously, the landscape is changing rapidly, and though there have been, little fluctuations here and there, his approval rating has remained steady. And so now we're keeping a close eye to see if there will be any impact due to primarily the government shutdown, which we'll cover in a little bit later. But now let's look at the main issue that's facing our society. And what we've really seen in the past few months, the main issue has gone from this place where political extremism and the economy were kind of moving closely in tandem, or maybe switching places here and there. We've really seen political extremism and threats to democracy eclipse the economy as the main issue, with the killing of Charlie Kirk and Melissa Hortman and her husband in Minnesota before that. I think that's only brought concerns about political extremism to the forefront. And frankly, the shift in the main issue, I think, really reflects the moment. It's very clear that there is growing anxiety over political extremism, over political violence, something that we've talked about a lot over the past few years. There is a widespread, deeply held belief that the system is broken. And as I noted before, high levels of mistrust. And so kind of taking all of these together, I think it really speaks to the moment that we're in, this sense of unease. That's not to say the economy is not important. We'll talk about that soon, but certainly I think this shift reflects the moment that we're in. And, however, when you look under the surface, though, Americans aren't uniform when it comes to the main issue, and that's been true for quite some time. So this is just one of the ways where our political polarization in society looks a little bit more like an actual divergence of priorities. The issue landscape varies pretty widely, right? If you look at the blue column of Democrats, the plurality have strongly coalesced around political extremism and threats to democracy. Republicans, on the other hand, are a little bit more divergent in what they consider to be the main issue priority right now. Political extremism. There has been an uptick among Republicans on political extremism in recent weeks, to be sure, but they also still cite the economy, and they're much more likely than Democrats or self-reported independents to cite immigration as the main issue. Incidentally, immigration also continues to be one of the strongest issues for President Trump right now. But just for another moment, let's keep the focus on political extremism. Clearly, it's easy to see this growing anxiety. I've talked about the fact that there is so much that divides us right now. And yet, there are still very commonly held values that Americans clearly agree on. And so I want to be very clear here that Americans, regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of your background, wholly reject political violence and violence in our society. So what this slide is showing is the percentage that disagree with the statements that you see across the bottom of your screen. And so more than 9 in 10 Americans disagree that it is acceptable for a member of their political party to threaten or intimidate others or to commit violence to achieve a political goal. Moreover, Americans do not believe that violent acts are acceptable to achieve a better society. And so while there is a lot that divides us right now, there are clear, commonly held values that still very much unite us. And I think this also speaks to the unease that people are feeling right now and a really strong rebuke to the violent acts that we've seen recently. Something else that's been in the news lately, this is from some polling that we did with NPR a couple weeks ago, is looking at attitudes toward crime in cities. And there is agreement with the American public here as well. 7 in 10 Americans agree that the level of crime and violence in American cities is unacceptably high, compared to about a quarter that say that crime and violence in our cities isn't much of a problem. 9 in 10 Republicans, but also a majority of Democrats and 2/3 of independents alike agree that crime is unacceptably high in our cities right now. So once again, there are some more commonly held beliefs. But where things start to splinter off a little bit is that while Americans kind of big picture see crime as a problem, there is still sort of this widespread disagreement about how to actually handle it. And more specifically, when it comes to deploying the National Guard in major cities, specifically in cities like DC and Memphis, as well as deployments to your local area, we see that few Americans support that, ranging from about 1 in 3 to just under 40%. And there is a significant partisan gap here. So partisanship really drives your attitudes on deploying National Guard troops to cities in the name of law enforcement. And finally, obviously, we need to give a nod to what's going on right now, which is the fact that our federal government remains shut down. And, you know, as you can see on this slide, neither side is going to leave this debate unscathed. But let's take a step back and talk about what else we know about the shutdown for a moment. First, we know that most Americans are concerned about the shutdown, again, at a top line level. Roughly half are worried that the shutdown could cause delays in the services that they rely on, such as Social Security or Medicare. Just this week, it was announced, you know, a last-ditch effort to get active duty military members their pay on time. But as this slide shows here, you know, neither side is probably going to come out looking good here. A majority of Americans, roughly about 3 in 5 in each instance, say that Republicans in Congress deserve a great deal or a fair amount of blame. Democrats in Congress, the same, as well as President Trump. Now, there's a little bit more intensity here if you look at President Trump and Republicans in Congress. Slightly more Americans are saying they deserve a great deal of the blame compared to Democrats in Congress. But again, it's, you know, finger pointing in all directions, or as we say here, a pox on all your houses. When we look at this, it's not shown on this slide, but when we look at this by party ID, as you'd expect, partisans blame each other, right? But independents, self-ascribed, those in the middle, right? They're more likely to blame President Trump or Republicans in Congress for the shutdown compared to pointing the finger at Democrats in Congress. Now let's turn to the economy here. We've shown this graphic on consumer confidence, I think, in all of our, you know, the New America webinars that we've done here, and just want to kind of give you an updated sense of where we are right now. So currently, consumer confidence remains muted when you compare it to a year ago or 2 years ago. There have been in recent months some very slight fluctuations here and there, maybe slightly up 1 month, slightly down 1 month, steady the next. But zoom out, and I think the broader sense is that consumer confidence just remains a little bit softer, there's a little more hesitation compared to years past. And, you know, the reason that there's 3 graphics on this slide, not only consumer confidence, but looking at that juxtaposed against the consumer price index, the measure of inflation, and self-reported job loss, we see that consumer confidence kind of tends to still be divorced from other macroeconomic indicators, such as these, or even stock market performance. So even as inflation may be easing or may have been easing earlier this year, we see that consumers, broadly speaking, still feel a lot of hesitation and unease about the current economic environment. And going under the hood a little bit deeper, I think what's driving this is again this short-term anxiety. So we have multiple sub-indices that feed into consumer confidence. And what we're seeing right now, and what we have been seeing for the past few months, is that sort of the outlook on the current economic situation and the investment question. So that's kind of your level of comfort with making a large investment right now. Those tend to be down a little bit. They're below this average that you're seeing here in that dark blue line. But when you ask people about their expectations for the future, expectations look a little bit rosier. So as we'll see later on when we talk about tariffs as well, there continues to be this sort of short-term unease, but still holding on to a little bit of some optimism for the future. And then here's from our Ipsos consumer tracker, just to unpack a little bit more about that unease. I want to draw your attention to the two bars that are 3 in from the right-hand side. Roughly half of Americans say that after paying their bills, they don't have money left over to spend on the things that they want. That sentiment has actually increased since earlier this year, since about 5 months ago in May, 7 percentage points. And similarly, we've seen a slight uptick in the number of Americans that agree that with the sentence, "I worry about paying my bills each month." 45% of Americans agree with that right now. This increase on "after paying my bills, I don't have the money left to spend on things that I want." This is actually at a high watermark, kind of tied with where we were in about August of 2022, which is where inflation rates were kind of right in the middle of their pretty steep climb post-COVID. And so again, you can look at the slide or the numbers on the left-hand side where you see a majority saying that they're waiting to start or to grow a family until they're in much better financial shape. But also a majority saying, even if it's a small amount, I can put away money each month. So there is a sense of planning for the future, and at the same time, there's anxiety about the future. And again, I think that increase in sentiment around not having money left over for basic needs, right, bills, etc., or wants, it really speaks to where Americans are in this current moment in time. And as I mentioned, we need to take a look at tariffs. A theme that we've continued to emphasize throughout this year is that Americans continue to be pretty divided on at least the longer term impact of tariffs. And there's a lot of uncertainty about where these economic policies will lead the country moving forward. This data is from a Washington Post Ipsos poll that we conducted last month. And one thing that we see clearly, if you look at the left-hand side on your screen, is that 7 in 10 Americans think that tariffs on imported goods are making the prices they buy go up, right? Very few, just 5%, say that they're making prices go down, and about a quarter say it's not making much difference. So overwhelmingly, Americans have acknowledged that in this moment in time, tariffs are making prices go up, right? So that's kind of that short-term unease that I had mentioned before. At the same time, though, there's a little bit more of a split between what this will look like in the longer term, though a plurality of Americans, not a majority, but a plurality, 43%, say that these economic policies will put the US economy on a weaker foundation in the long term. We do, however, have more Americans, 31%, saying that these policies will put us on a stronger foundation in the long term, and many, 20%, say it's too soon to say. So a little bit more reserving judgment for what this means for the long term or for looking ahead. And then finally, I wanted to share some new research that we put out. This is a study that was done in 10 countries earlier this year, our Brand America study. And really what this sought to look at was in 10 countries, we asked about a number of brands, global brands. And what we found was that, and I'm taking the average here of all of these brands that we asked about, but if a brand is perceived as an American brand versus an international brand, that was a question we asked. Does each brand, is it American, international, or local? Very few said local for all of these. But if a brand is perceived as American, there is a negative impact on trust of the brand and also purchase intent across the non-US markets, excuse me, that we fielded in. Pretty universally, those that perceive a brand as international are more likely to say that they trust that brand and that they would purchase from the brand. And so really, if you look in purple here, only in America itself is being perceived as an American brand a net positive for trust and purchase intent right now. But in all other markets, these brands are much better off if they're perceived as an international brand. So again, kind of taking a step back and thinking about the implications in our society right now for brands, this has a potential impact here, right? We're looking at trust and purchase intent. And so there's a very real world impact on being perceived as an American brand in this point in time, rather than being perceived as, a global or even a local brand in other areas of the world. So something certainly to keep an eye on. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Alec and welcome him to talk about the state of the political parties. Alec, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mallory, and hello, everyone. It's great to be with you. Where I'm going to pick up on our slide deck here is with the state of the political parties. And it's a great time to take stock of where the parties stand, their brands with the American public, where they stand in issues, about a year ahead of the US midterm elections. So let's just jump right into the data here. First place to start is with issues. Which party has the better plan or policy on a range of issues? You can see those issues across the bottom here. And a few points we want to make with this slide. The first one I think comes across in the visual, right? Which is the Republican Party on balance holds an issue advantage over the Democratic Party on most of the issues we test here. Now, an important thing to think about anytime you're looking at a slide like this with issue advantage between one party or the other is what are the most important or salient issues for Americans, right? Because it's really the intersection of advantage and salience that really matters when you talk about the parties and issues. So where should we focus our attention? Well, the US economy, a 10-point advantage for the Republican Party in terms of the one seen as better able to handle it by the American public. Other issues that rank highly on the public's priority list, immigration, crime, you see those on the far left part of this slide. Again, issues where the Republican Party has a pretty strong advantage, actually quite a striking advantage of 20 points and 18 points. Democratic Party does hold advantages on issues of traditional strength for the party, on environment and climate, and on healthcare. Healthcare in particular ranks towards the middle or towards the top of the issue list. Environment and climate is less of a public concern, more of a concern within the Democratic Party. So it's a way in which they have an edge on this issue, but it doesn't rank as highly as, say, the US economy or immigration on the list. So here we establish a GOP edge relative to the Democratic Party on issues. As we move ahead here, we zoom out just a little bit and we asked Americans to assess, what do you think of the collection of views represented by the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? And what we see here is consistent with that first slide in that there's a modest edge for the Republican Party here. That green share in the middle, the share who say the views of the party are about right, more say this about the Republican Party, 37%, than say this about the Democratic Party, 31%. When it comes to the Democratic Party, a narrow majority of Americans, 54%, say that their views are too liberal in the minds of our respondents here, of all US adults. Now, it's only narrowly better for the Republican Party. 49% of Americans say the Republican Party's views are too conservative when we ask Americans to assess them. So if you really take a step back here, a point I also want to introduce, which I think is consistent with our our Know the New America themes, is these are not overwhelming endorsements from Americans of either political party. Yes, the Republican Party has a narrow advantage in terms of being seen as about right in their views, but it's still only 37%. So the broader theme here, the broader context, is neither party registers widely with Americans as being on the mark in terms of their mix of views. We'll break down this data just a bit further. What you see here is views within the party or intra-party views. So Democrats rating their own party, Republicans rating their own party. And what you see here is a bit of weakness within the Democratic Party. 62% of Democrats say their own party has about the right mix of views, but 22% say they're too liberal, and a fair amount say they're too conservative. So what I see in this data is a Democratic Party that within its own base is still working to define or searching for an identity here. Yes, 62% is a majority, but many Democrats, almost 4 in 10, aren't necessarily satisfied with their own party's positions on key issues. You go to the Republican Party slide and you see a bit of a different story here. There's wider agreement among Republicans that their own party has about the right mix of views. That's that large 80%. And then to the extent that there is a critique here, it's a sense among 14% of Republicans that the party's too conservative. Relatively few, pretty small shares say that the Republican Party's views are too liberal. This, I think, is a really powerful sentiment. We asked folks whether they agreed or disagreed with the sentiment, and 62% of Americans agree with the statement that the Democratic Party has lost its way, right? I think that connects to where we've been in terms of some relative issue weakness or ideological weakness for the Democratic Party. That 62% of Americans believe, or at least align with the statement that the Democratic Party has lost its way, I think is a pretty powerful sentiment. Now, just as we were talking about on the previous slide, looking within the party groups is pretty interesting here. Perhaps not a surprise that Republicans are critical of the Democratic Party. 83% say that they've lost their way. But look at that figure among Democrats. Again, this is folks within their own party. 46% of Democrats, almost half, say their own party has lost its way. That was really striking when we were looking at this data. Again, it's a party that's out of power in the White House, and I think is looking to define or find its identity. Now, data for the Republican Party is marginally better, but even so, it's consistent with the themes that we've talked about. Almost half of Americans say the same of the Republican Party, that they have lost their way, and that includes a large share of Democrats, 81%. What's a bit different here, and again, it connects with the slides we've just been on, is that criticism within the Republicans' own party is fairly modest. 19% say their own party has lost its way. Again, that compares with 46% of Democrats who say that with their own party. Then as we move into the next slide here, this might come as a bit of a surprise. We've just been talking about some Democratic Party relative weakness relative to the Republican Party, but when we ask folks to look ahead to the midterm elections by a 53 to 42% margin, more Americans say they would prefer the Democrats to control the next Congress to act as a check on Trump, rather than for Republicans to control Congress to support Trump's agenda. So I think the question wording itself suggests part of the explanation for this is that in many ways, midterm elections are a referendum on the sitting president, and there's sentiment or a feeling among Americans that even with some weakness in the Democratic Party's issue positions and relative brand, that to serve as a check to Trump, there's support for them controlling the next midterm election House, the House of Representatives or Congress. As we go to the next slide, it's important to acknowledge that part of this is structural. It's cyclical. In American politics, the party of the sitting president often loses seat in midterm elections. In fact, they almost always lose seats in midterm elections. The exceptions are rare and I think have particular conditions. If you remember in 2002, this is post 9/11 when George W. Bush had a moment of national unity and consolidated Republican support. Those moments are rare in American politics. And so yes, part of this is structural and cyclical, the sense that Americans are looking for the party that's out of power in the White House to perhaps do better in the midterms. But that's not the full story here, and we have some data on the next slide here, which I think rounds out the picture here. And that's just this. I think a very powerful finding here is that 62% of Americans say that since taking office, they believe President Trump has acted beyond his authority as president, a really assertive use of the executive office. As a reference point, our partners asked the same question about President Joe Biden, who was not terribly popular during his term, certainly not towards the end of his term, but the sense that he overreached executive power was not among the top critiques. Only a third say he went beyond his authority, 2/3 say he didn't. So when we think back to this preference for midterm control and a preference among the public for Democrats to control the House of Representatives, yes, part of it's structural and cyclical in American politics, but even despite the relative weakness of the Democratic brand, there are reasons why the public is looking for a balance of power or a check on executive power, and I think this slide helps to illustrate that point. As we've been talking, that's sort of the strategic lay of the land a year out from the midterms, and certainly things can change. There's a lot of time now between when people actually vote and what we're seeing in the data here. This data for me is almost a step back, and it's more consistent with these themes of the Know the New America initiative more generally, which is a widespread sense among Americans that traditional parties and politicians don't care about people like me. 64% of all Americans align with that statement. It's true across age groups, it's true across partisan groups. So the broader context here is dissatisfaction with the options or the responsiveness of the major parties and the major elected officials. We see that really, really clearly in this slide. And as we go to the final slide here, we could have put this slide up in Mallory's first section. We could put it here. It's a striking finding that I think is in line with the slide before. It's really the broadest context for American politics right now. Yes, we're polarized. Yes, we're divided. But do we still have more in common? Or is there a sense that we're splitting apart as a country? I personally was a bit surprised by these findings. I thought more would register with this sentiment shown in the orange bar, that yes, we're divided, but there's still more that unites us as Americans. But only a quarter express that attitude. Far more, 74% say not only are we divided, but we have the sense that we're splitting apart as a country. So that's the broadest possible context of American politics today, a sense of not feeling seen or having your leaders register with your concerns, in a sense that as a nation, there's really serious challenges to our cohesion in our politics and our system here. So powerful findings that I wanted to share to give you the broadest view of our structure. So a bit of a transition here to AI, and AI is a topic I think we're all interested in. We see it shaping our lives, but it does connect to our broader themes here, in that AI is also a major destabilizing force for many Americans. It's rapid technological change. It can provoke unease or uncertainty. It can have impacts on the job market. We know this is happening now. So as we go through these AI slides, it's both interesting in and of itself, and it's also so interesting to consider in the context of our Know the New America, another destabilizing force in American politics. So let's just jump right into what we have with the slides here. I want to focus on the middle part of this slide. What we see here is the increasing role of AI in Americans' life. Close to half say they've used an AI chat program, 49%. That's up from just 22% in March 23. We know adoption is scaling up rapidly, but that's a really striking finding, I think. And then you go over a little bit to the left of the slide and you see that 58% of Americans say they've used an AI-assisted internet search program. In my view, this is something of a tipping point, right? When everyday Americans, not just white-collar professionals or folks in certain industries, but everyday Americans are having daily AI-augmented, or at least regular AI-augmented online experiences. So that's what this slide shows here. Now, we know folks are using AI a lot more. What about how do they trust AI, or how do they think about the results that AI provides? And what we see here is a great deal of caution. That middle blue is trust a little. I think that's a very ambivalent response. If you look at the trust a lot of trust in accurate results, just 17%. A lot of trust in unbiased results, just 16%. A lot of trust on privacy, only 14%. So we see, even as Americans are using AI more often, there are deep concerns across reliability, unbiased data, and especially privacy. As we think about concerns around AI, in our thinking, there's a big three, and privacy is one of those big threes, and this is one of the ways you can measure the concern around privacy. As we go to the next slide here, we see widespread concern about the potential risk of AI job displacement. 71% say they are very or somewhat concerned that AI will put too many people out of work permanently. You can look across political groups, and what you see here is it's a really widely held view. It doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat, what area of life you come from, you're concerned about AI job displacement. And this is, I think, the second of the big three AI concerns we see impacts on American jobs. And then as we go to this next slide, concern around this idea of people replacing their in-person relationships with AI companions. A majority of Americans express concern about that. You can measure this sentiment in a number of different ways, but we see this as the third big concern around AI is its impact on humans or the human element of life. Folks don't necessarily want to go to the doctor and have an experience that's overly influenced by AI. They look for human or personal connections in so many aspects of life. So you can ask these questions different way, but that's a theme we keep seeing in the data, that there is public concern around how AI will influence or perhaps disrupt or even replace personal relationships. And so as you drift down to the bottom bar of this slide, what does this all add up to? It's a sense that these unpredictable consequences, perhaps that we're unable to control, this is what we mean when we say that AI is a disruptive force in American society right now. This is the sense of unease or uncertainty we're talking about, that 2/3 express this sort of generalized sense that we don't know what the consequences are going to be and we might not be able to control them. So this leads us to the idea of government regulation. 61% say the government should regulate artificial intelligence, in this case to ensure economic stability. You can ask the question a number of different ways, whether it's in the context of the economy or other contexts, and you see consistent support for government regulation. And if you look at this slide, you'll see something really interesting or really quite unusual. A majority of Republicans support government regulation of artificial intelligence. That sort of flips the traditional party position among Republicans, sort of an anti-regulation stance. And that's what we see with AI, is that the partisan positions or queuing or differences have not been well established, and in some cases it can flip or disrupt traditional patterns of attitudes that we see around concepts like regulation. So a very interesting time to be looking at data around AI, and I would summarize by saying we see increased usage, widespread concern, particularly among three dimensions of privacy, jobs, and the human impact. And what that all adds up to is a sense of unease and strong support for government regulation. And I'll hand it back over to Mallory for our next section here.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alec. Appreciate it. To round things out today, we have a little bit of fresh data around public health. Certainly one of the other topics that has been in the news lately, and we've seen some interesting divides, and I think kind of encapsulate some of these trends, namely decline in trust in institutions really well. So let's dive into it. So first, when we think about public health, there's a number of different ways that we can kind of take this conversation, right? But as we enter sixth season, as people are or aren't getting their flu and COVID shots, we wanted to take a look at where Americans are on vaccinations right now. And as you can see on the top line here, just under half of Americans have a sense of concern around future vaccine access, specifically for children. Concerned that future children won't be able to get the vaccines they need to stay healthy. But I want to draw your attention to the roughly 60 percentage point gap, how far apart those red and blue dots are here. As you might expect, this is one of those topics that partisanship does play a really impactful role here. This concern over vaccine access, particularly as vaccination recommendations and guidelines are being changed, is of high concern for those that identify as Democrats, but is not a significant concern for Republicans. And independents kind of look pretty close to the top line level, just over 4 in 10. Similarly, there's concern that people themselves, adults themselves, won't be able to get the vaccinations they need to stay healthy in the future. Concern is a little bit diminished compared to children, but it follows similar patterns. We also asked people whether they agree that the federal government's recent recommendation that people get fewer vaccines is based on scientific evidence and fact. And we see that few Americans, just over 1 in 5, agree with that sentiment. And we're hovering around the single digits for Democrats. And even Republicans are a little bit mixed on that. So that's something that we also saw, again, not visualized because the data just came out a few hours ago, but something that we also saw in our latest American Health Index research. There's a lot of kind of uncertainty around current guidelines, how they've changed, what that looks like. But one thing that is clear, a majority of Americans agree that it should be easier to understand vaccine guidelines. It should be easier to understand basic information around health and wellness. And so there's this sense that there is a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of chatter online. We saw that in our American Health Index data that's out today. It's available on our website. But they're really just looking for, regardless of what side you land on, they're just looking for a little bit more ease of information access. So this is from data earlier this year, but we also just released a new number today that follows a similar pattern. So what we've seen over time is that this is among the general public, adults 18 and up, so not just parents. But there is this slight erosion or sort of softer support in the belief that parents should follow the CDC's recommended child immunization schedules for getting their kids vaccinated. So I want to point you to those two bars on the right. You can see here that in February earlier this year, 51% strongly agreed that that was the case. And in June, and now in fact as well, roughly 40% strongly agree. So that's, even though the majority of Americans, roughly 3 in 4 now, still agree that Americans should follow the CDC's recommended child immunization schedules, there's been some erosion in kind of the strength of the support there. And interestingly, it is happening on both sides of the political aisle, albeit for different reasons, right? For Democrats, and there's a question of whether or not they trust what is the information that's coming out from this current administration's CDC, HHS, other public health agencies. And for Republicans, as you saw on the last slide, it's a little bit more about kind of following the cues and clues from party leaders such as President Trump and HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. That are, kind of downplaying the importance of vaccines. I also want to note, as we talk about trust here, in our American Health Index data that we released today, we are actually seeing an overall decline in trust and kind of moving to really low levels the lowest level we've seen in the past few years when it comes to trusting the CDC, the FDA for health and wellness information. And that decline in trust is primarily driven by Democrats who have shifted away from trusting, again, these public health agencies and arms of the current administration right now. So there's, again, this interplay of trust in information and trust in messengers right now is having an impact on whether or not you follow the guidelines given. So also on vaccines, I do think it's important to note that it really does depend on how we ask the question. I'm showing this slide to kind of go back to that, top line point right at the beginning of our discussion today about how nuance really matters. Okay, this data is from a couple of months ago, where we were asking specifically about vaccinating children against measles, right? This was during a period of time where there was a measles outbreak in multiple states, where some children had actually died because of measles. And what we find is that here, there actually is common ground among Americans. 3 in 4 at that point in time said it is the duty of all parents to vaccinate their children against measles. So again, a lot of this depends on question wording and framing, but when you talk about a specific issue here, in this case, measles, you do see that there is common ground. Similarly, 75% said all children should be vaccinated, except for those whom vaccination poses a direct risk. 2 in 3 Republicans agree with that, right? Where we start to kind of see the most explicit form of pushback on is on this question of parental choice versus like mandatory vaccines. And what we see is that just under half, 47%, said that parents should be allowed to choose whether or not to vaccinate their children. A majority of Republicans agree with that, as well as 1 in 3 Democrats. And again, I think that that kind of goes to recent guidance that we've seen come from this administration about changing vaccine guidance, not just for children, but for adults themselves, you know, looking at new COVID vaccine guidance, right? It's more about individuals making a decision for themselves in conjunction with their healthcare provider. Now, I will say our latest data tells us that few Americans are actually aware of or familiar with these guidelines. We see that fewer than half say that they're familiar with this revised guidance from the CDC. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Taken on the whole, you know, these questions around public health, on vaccines, and also on things like food labeling and additives and dyes in foods, which are not shown here. While partisanship tells us a lot of the story, it doesn't tell us everything, right? And I think it's important to note just the environment that we're in right now is one where Americans are clearly telling us that they don't have a lot of trust in historically trusted messengers and in other institutions. And they feel that at the bottom line, regardless of what your stance is on these issues, it really should be easier to understand the lay of the land right now. All right, leaving just a few time for questions, I want to wrap it up here and just come back to this notion of knowing the new America. Here are some ways that we at Ipsos work with our clients every single day to advise them on how to navigate this current point in time, right? This notion of authenticity is critical. Understanding the shared values that do exist in our society, freedom, fairness, rebuke against political violence, right? Concerns around political extremism. Brands need to kind of know where they stand on that continuum, put a message around these topics in a way that's authentic, right? And then, of course, where we as researchers come in is using research to test strategies, to know who your audience is or isn't, to know exactly who you're trying to speak to and what your communications territories are. So there's a resource link at the bottom, and this will be included in the webinar slides that get sent out as well. And then just to close, wanted to say thanks for joining us today. And here's a link to some of our latest resources, including that new Brand America study that I mentioned earlier on. So I'll stop sharing and I'll turn it over to Alec, see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Mallory. That's great. And yeah, we have questions coming in. Please put your questions into the chat. And as they continue to come in, Mallory, I think the first one I see in the queue here is probably well suited for you. It's a question here around public statements or sentiments from pharmaceutical companies around health as people are talking about health information. Do we have any data on how people think about these statements around health that are from private companies selling health and wellness information?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've not asked about trust in pharmaceutical companies directly, but I think there's a couple of things that we can say. The first is that there's an overwhelming sense that people that share information about health and wellness online, so again, not necessarily pharmaceutical companies, I'm thinking more about kind of influencers and folks in that space, there is a strong sense from a majority of Americans that they're not doing it actually for the benefit of people's health and well-being, but it's for money, right? Again, we are in this environment where trust is at an all-time low, and people have their antennas up for something like that too. I would also encourage folks to check out our Global Trustworthiness Index that Ipsos releases annually, where we do actually look at trust in different professions. including healthcare workers, at least. I don't think that pharmaceutical companies are in there, but that's always a great resource to look at kind of the shifting landscape of trust, not only in the US, but around the world.
That's great. And then in the chat here, there's a comment to summarize around Trump approval rating and any impact on midterm elections. Maybe I can start on that and Mallory can chime in. I think the question is essentially with Trump approval rating fairly steady, what impact could or might that have on the midterms? First of all, it's very early, it's hard to say, but if you think about elections, elections are about both persuasion and turnout, and midterm elections are particularly about turnout. As Mallory introduced at the start, Trump's approval rating is moving at a pretty narrow range, but persuasion or enthusiasm is a different dimension, right? You can be really excited to vote, regardless of what your approval or disapproval sentiment is. They're almost two separate issues. So I think the most important thing to watch over the next year is the relative enthusiasm of the two partisan bases, even if the approval rating continues to trade in a fairly narrow range there.
Yep, and I tend to agree. And yeah, I guess it's never too early to start talking about the midterms, right? Further than 1 year out. But the other thing I would just note is kind of a callback to that slide that you showed, Alec, about historical patterns, right? And understanding that to a certain extent, you know, Democrats always have an enthusiasm challenge, right? Clearly, they are harder on their party right now, more critical of their party than Republicans are about theirs, okay? But to a certain extent, I think it's also important to note just kind of the phase that we're in, and that Americans do also potentially want a check against the president. And so there's a lot to kind of keep an eye on, both, you know, can Democrats recover their own brand among their base? And is the president's approval rating kind of pretty stubbornly steady despite what's happening in the broader environment right now? Those are some other things that I think we'll be keeping an eye on.
Great, and I think our last question today in the chat here, it's about questionnaire design and just being sensitive to how you frame. I'm reading it now, questions around vaccination, including the measles vaccination. Maybe we can just talk generally about how we think about question wording when it comes to sensitive questions like childhood vaccines and others.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a couple of things I'll say. One, for us, it's always important to not only measure attitudes around these topics, but also awareness of the current landscape, right? And as I noted, you know, there is a lot of misinformation in the public health space, which makes this somewhat of a challenge to measure. And we see that many Americans are not familiar with current guidelines around childhood vaccines or vaccinations for adults when it comes to COVID-19, for example. So that, I think, in and of itself is part of the story. But then the other thing I'll say is back to the beginning is that we as pollsters have to remember that words matter. And so to be as specific in our wording, what we're asking, because as I showed on these slides, right, you get a different result if you ask people about vaccinating children against measles versus, you know, vaccinating children against all things or just not specifying. And so I think it just shows the degree that nuance does matter and reminds us that we need to be as precise as possible when we're asking these questions in a way that the public understands what we're trying to ask.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place for us to leave it. Thank you all for joining us. Please look for a recording of the session online, and please look for upcoming information about our next public opinion webinar. Thank you for being with us today.